The afternoon heat lay heavy over Red Hollow when the sound split the air like a rifle shot. The leather strap tore across the widow's shoulders, and she crumpled hard into the dry, sun-baked earth. Nobody moved. Not a single soul. The sheriff stood still. The preacher stood still. Dozens of ordinary people watched from their shaded porches without making a sound, every pair of eyes locked onto the woman broken in the dirt. Her only sin in this merciless valley was outliving the husband who might have protected her. "Do it again," the land baron commanded. His tone carried no heat, no passion, just the cold certainty of a man who had never once been told no. The deputy hoisted the thick cowhide whip back over his head, ready to bring it down on the already bleeding woman. Then a voice arrived, quiet, measured, impossible to ignore. "That dead isn't real." Every head in Red Hollow turned at once. At the far end of the main street, a lone rider sat perfectly still on a dusty, road-worn horse. A dark hat sat low over his brow, throwing half his face into shadow. Trail dust coated every inch of his long coat. One rough hand hung loose near the grip of a well-used revolver. His eyes moved from the deputy to the woman bleeding in the dirt and stayed there. "You lift that whip one more time," the stranger said, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, "and you'll settle that with me first." The whole town stopped breathing. Nobody in Red Hollow knew the man's name yet, but before the sun touched the horizon, not one of them would ever forget it. 24 hours earlier, Red Hollow had still belonged to working people, at least on paper. Maeve Callahan had spent 55 hard years on this earth, and nearly 30 of them building something worth keeping. She and her husband had carved their ranch out of Rocky Hill country through sheer stubbornness and honest labor. They raised cattle, mended fences, weathered droughts, and asked nothing from anyone they hadn't earned first. Maeve was the kind of woman her neighbors borrowed flour from and returned it doubled. She was the first wagon at your door when sickness came, the last one to leave when the work wasn't finished. Then the frontier did what the frontier always eventually does. 1 week ago, her husband went to bed with a fever and never woke up. Maeve was alone on a property that suddenly felt enormous. She hadn't even chosen a burial plot yet when the pounding started on her front door. Barnaby Thorne didn't knock so much as announce himself. He was the most powerful man in the county, and he carried himself the way men like that always do. Like the ground itself owed him something. He didn't come with a hat in hand or a word of sympathy. He came with a stack of legal-looking documents and a deadline. He claimed Maeve's husband had borrowed an enormous sum to keep the operation alive through the brutal winter months. Every coin of it, Thorne informed her, was due by Friday noon. 3 days, he said, mud from his boots smearing across her clean floor. "Bring the gold or the ranch, the livestock, and this house transfer to me." Every stick and stone of it. Maeve stood in her own kitchen, feeling the floor shift beneath her feet. Her husband had despised debt. He talked about owing money the way other men talked about rattlesnakes, something to be avoided at all costs and never invited inside. When Thorne finally left, she picked up the papers and held them close to the window light. The signature at the bottom turned her stomach. The handwriting was clumsy, rushed, nothing like her husband's careful, deliberate script. Someone had copied it badly and hoped she wouldn't look closely enough. She looked. She knew. And then she rode. Her first stop was the bank because she still believed institutions meant something. The banker took one glance at the documents, slid them back across the counter without meeting her eyes, and offered her nothing but an apology so hollow it echoed. "Mr. Thorne says it's legitimate," he murmured at the wood grain of his desk. "The bank has already recognized the claim. My hands are tied, Maeve." She went next to the neighbors her husband had pulled out of hard times with his own 2 hands. She didn't ask for much, just a word spoken in the right place, a witness, someone willing to stand beside her. Door after door cracked open just wide enough for a face and an excuse. "We want to help you, Maeve, we do," one man said through a 3-inch gap. "But Thorne holds our mortgage too. If we move against him, we lose everything we've got." The sheriff was her last real hope, and he extinguished it casually. She dropped the forged papers directly onto his lap, laid out the case plainly, and demanded Thorne face a judge. The sheriff picked up his pocket knife, looked at her like she'd asked him to rope the moon, and told her Thorne was a community pillar. "Pay what you owe, Mrs. Callahan," he said, already returning to his whittling. "And stop wasting my afternoon." She tried selling off cattle to raise quick cash. Thorne had already made his rounds. Every potential buyer in the county had been warned off. She was surrounded on every side. The system in Red Hollow hadn't simply failed, it had been deliberately constructed to serve one man. Thorne owned the banker's loyalty, the sheriff's cooperation, and the silence of every frightened family trying to hold on to what little they had left. Friday came in blazing and merciless. Thorne had planned this moment carefully. Crushing Maeve Callahan publicly wasn't just about one ranch. It was a message broadcast to every soul in the valley. Obey or watch what happens to people who don't. At sunrise, 2 of his hired men rode out to the ranch without knocking. They broke through her front door, dragged her outside into the early morning chill, bound her wrists behind her back, and marched her into town on horseback like a prisoner of war. People pressed their faces to shuttered windows. Children were pulled back from doorways. The whole town watched and said absolutely nothing. Thorne planted himself in the center of the main street, wearing his smugness like a second vest. His deputy shoved Maeve against the hitching post outside the general store. "Look carefully," Thorne called out to the hidden faces watching from every direction. This is what happens to anyone foolish enough to think they can shortchange Barnaby Thorne. Look carefully and remember it. The deputy drew the whip back. The crack exploded through the hot air. Maeve went down. And across the street, a quiet voice said, "That dead isn't real." The deputy turned slowly, his jaw tight, hand drifting toward his holster. He sized up the lone rider at the edge of town and decided he wasn't impressed. "Whatever's happening here is official business," he called back, his voice carrying the rehearsed authority of a man who'd never had it seriously challenged. "Ride on before this becomes your problem." The stranger didn't answer immediately. He clicked his tongue, eased his horse forward at a slow, deliberate walk, and stopped just a few yards short of Thorne and the deputy. Dust curled around the horse's legs and settled. Thorne stepped forward, tugging at the bottom of his vest, working his face into the expression that usually ended conversations. "You've wandered into the wrong town at the wrong moment, friend. Ride away or they'll be burying you before dark." The stranger pushed his hat back just slightly, enough to reveal a pair of eyes that looked like they'd cataloged every variety of human ugliness the frontier manufactured, and were no longer particularly surprised by any of it. "Name's Jace," he said, still quiet, still unhurried. "And I've seen enough men hiding theft behind forged paperwork to recognize it from 100 yards. Before Thorne could signal his enforcers, Jace was already off his horse. The movement was almost casual, until it wasn't. He stepped around the deputy like he wasn't there, snapped open a small pocket knife, and drew it clean through the ropes at Maeve's wrists in a single stroke. She lurched forward and caught herself against the post. She stared up at him like she wasn't entirely sure he was real. "Get her inside the saloon," Jace told the bartender frozen in the doorway. "Water, shade, and keep her there." Thorne had gone the color of old brick. He jabbed a finger at his 4 enforcers. "Put him down. Right now." 4 hands went for 4 guns. Not one of them cleared leather in time. A single shot cracked down the street. One enforcer spun sideways and dropped, grabbing his shoulder, his revolver already in the dirt. The remaining 3 looked at their colleague, then at Jace, who had somehow already covered Thorne with the barrel of his revolver without any of them seeing him draw. The street was so silent you could hear the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Guns down," Jace said. The sound of iron hitting dry dirt followed 4 times over. Jace reached into his coat and produced a folded document. The same fraudulent debt ledger Thorne had waved in Maeve's face just days before. He opened it and held it up where the afternoon sun hit it cleanly. "I've passed through this territory before," he said, loud enough for every shuttered window to hear. "Few years back. Met a lot of good, honest ranching families. Also heard plenty about a scheme. A man forging signatures, cooking up fake debts, taking land from people too isolated to fight back." He turned the paper slowly. "This signature is a forgery. Same technique used on the Miller property 2 years ago. Same trick that drove the Henderson family off land they'd held for 15 years. Something shifted in the crowd. A murmur moved through the porches, traveling from one person to the next like a lit fuse. People looked at each other and then at the ground. They had known. Maybe not the specifics, but they had known something was wrong, and they had chosen their own safety over their neighbors' lives. "This man is not a businessman," Jace continued, scanning the faces appearing now at the edges of porches and doorways. He's a thief with a sheriff on his payroll and a whole town too frightened to say so out loud. Behind him, he heard boots shuffling. The sheriff had decided this was an excellent moment to find somewhere else to be. "Sheriff," Jace didn't turn around. "Stay exactly where you are." Maeve walked back out through the saloon doors. Her back ached with every breath and would for days, but she held her chin level and her eyes steady. She looked at Barnaby Thorne, who had ridden into her kitchen and threatened to take everything she'd ever built, now kneeling in the same dirt he'd thrown her into. The invisible wall that had kept Red Hollow paralyzed for years, that suffocating mixture of fear, debt, and manufactured helplessness, crumbled fast once the first crack appeared. Townspeople stepped off porches. Men who had hidden behind excuses picked up whatever was at hand. They walked to the sheriff with purpose, clapped iron cuffs on his wrists without ceremony, and made sure they clicked. Thorne was bound with the same rope he'd ordered used on Maeve. The fraudulent papers were carried to the center of the street, dropped into a burning barrel, and reduced to ash in under a minute. People surrounded Maeve's porch as the sky turned orange and purple overhead. They brought food. They brought apologies, the earnest, ashamed kind that cost something to say. They made promises to show up at her ranch with tools and labor until everything was put right. Maeve let them talk. She scanned the end of the street. The lone rider was already a shrinking shape against the fading light, moving down the trail without looking back. No farewell, no acknowledgement of gratitude, just a tired horse and a man who apparently had somewhere else to be. Red Hollow exhaled for the first time in years. The valley still had hard days ahead, but it belonged to its people again. That much at least had been settled before sunset.